Hey everyone, it's Joel here from MiddleLink. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can use the Attributes API by Finsweet with MiddleLink to securely fetch data from an external source and then display it within your Webflow project. Now for this example, I'm going to be fetching data from Airtable, and this is going to be a continuation on from the video Alex created last week. So this isn't going to be a deep dive into the Attributes API. I highly recommend that you watch the videos by Alex, and I'll link those below. So just to give you a bit of a recap, in those videos, Alex walks you through how you can set this up, and he uses the fake store API, which is something you can use for development. Now, this video is for those who are looking to take the next step and to connect it to their own data source, in this instance, Airtable. So this is what we'll be creating, and we're not actually going to spend that much time within Webflow. I'm not going to be running through how to create this template. Instead, we're going to be focusing on the type definitions when you're working with Airtable, and also how to set up the workflow within MiddleLink. So to show you what the outcome will be, is here we've got a page. When I refresh the page, a request is made. The data is fetched from Airtable, it's then formatted server-side and returns back to the browser where it's rendered with the Attributes API. And as you can see, we can also leverage the power of CMS filtering, sorting, and pagination. So here, if I select food, we can see that the collection updates. We can then sort A to Z. We can reset the filters, sort Z to A, for example. And then we can also load more. So in order to do this, or in order to connect to an external API without exposing your API key, you need some form of middleware. And that's where MiddleLink comes in. So this is the workflow we're going to be creating. So here we're making a HTTP request. We're then checking whether the request was successful. And we're then selecting the data, flattening it, selecting which columns we want, and then renaming the columns just so it makes it easier to work with on the front end. Now, I'm going to start from scratch, so I'll be deleting this. This is just so I could show you the example at the beginning. But before we do that, I just want to show you the Airtable base. So this is a very simple Airtable base, and this is purely for demonstration purposes. But I thought a restaurant menu would be a really good example because it's something a restaurant may not want to be indexed by search engines, but you may want to display on your website, and it will be far easier to manage within a service like Airtable. So here we've got the title, we've then got an image, we've got a category, and you can by all means use relationships and field relationships between different tables. I'm keeping it very simple for this example, and we're just using a select field. Next, we've got the price, and then we've got the description. So those who have already seen the video by Alex, you may notice that these kind of match up to the fields that were being used in that video for the products, and that is by design because I don't want to get too deep into the weeds with the type definitions. However, there are some changes that we will be making so that you can work with images and effectively set up the type definition for Airtable images, and we'll get onto that later in the video. So now we've seen the base. The next thing we're going to want to do is set up our workflow. So if you're already a MiddleLink user, you can just go to the workflows and create a workflow. If you're not a user, then you'd need to register an account, create a project, and then you'll be able to carry on. And I'd just like to mention that you don't need to have a paid account to follow along with this. You can absolutely do this with a free account, and you'll have 100 requests per month, but you can enable caching up to 24 hours so that you're not going to reach your limit unless you're wanting to update it frequently. So I'm going to create a new workflow. I'm going to call this get menu tutorial. And we're going to set the method to be get, as we're going to be fetching data rather than sending data. We're going to have more videos next week on how you can send data to external sources. But for now, we're going to be getting data. So I'll click create. And now we've got the canvas where we can build out our workflow. So before we start building, I'm just going to go over to the Airtable API documentation, because I think this will just be valuable if we refer to the documentation as we're building this out. So here you can see I've gone to the base in question, and then I've gone down to the menu table on list records. And I'll make this base clonable so you can follow along with it. Next, I'm going to go into MiddleLink, and I'm going to drag the HTTP request node. And this effectively allows you to call an external API from the MiddleLink server, so you can by all means connect to your own backend or other no-code databases like NoCodeDB or BaseRow. Next, I'm going to go to the settings, and here we need to build out our request. The first thing we're going to need is the endpoint URL. So if we go to Airtable, the documentation, and here we'll see the URL that we'll need to call. So I'm going to copy that. We're going to go back into MiddleLink, and we're going to paste the URL. Now you will notice that there are some URL parameters, and those are the values after the question mark. So I'm going to remove everything after the question mark, including the question mark. And this is just because we can define these later on below in a more visual way. Next, you're going to need to set up your connection, and this will be your Airtable API key. Now, I've already added mine, but to add yours, you can click the Add button, leave the provider as other in this instance, enter the name, and then the secret key, or in this instance, your API key. And your API key will be secured and encrypted, and it will never be returned back to the client. Once you've added your key, you'll be able to select it. And next we need to set the method. So if we go to the documentation, this is going to be a GET request, and we can see that here. So we'll go back to MiddleLink and we'll change the method to GET. We're going to skip over the caching options for now. We'll come back to this at the end of the video when we optimize the endpoint. Next, we're going to need to add our headers. And again, I'm going to jump back to the Airtable API documentation. And at the top of the documentation, you'll see the headers that are required. So for this request and all Airtable requests, we'll need to pass our API key with the key authorization, and it should be prefixed with the word bearer. So I'm going to copy authorization, go back to MiddleLink, I'm going to add a header, and to paste authorization, I'm going to type bearer. And then you do not want to paste your API key within this field, as this isn't an encrypted field. Instead, what we can do is reference the connection we defined above. And to do that, you can use the mustache syntax. And then this will display all of the dynamic variables you can reference, and you'll get more variables available as you build out your request and add more nodes. For now, we're just going to select the connection key. And then next, you've got the query strings. So here you can add the query strings, for example, the ones we removed when we first added the URL. So if we take a quick look at the base here, we've got a few views, and one of those views is the website view. So I'm going to add that as a query string. So we can add view, website view. Oops. And it's worth noting, these are case sensitive. And the view doesn't restrict the fields that are shown. However, it does let you do the sorting within Airtable. So for example, if we take a look here, we can see this view is sorted by category. So this is going to be how the data is returned. Instead, we could sort by A to Z, or whatever we prefer. But for example, if you hide fields, a view doesn't prevent those fields from being returned. And you can read more about this in the documentation here. So we've effectively set up the connection to Airtable now, so we can click save. And whenever you save a node, you're prompted to run it, and I highly recommend you run the node. It just makes it a lot easier as you're building out your workflow. So then the next node has access to the previous node's data. So I'm going to run the node, or run the workflow, shall I say. And now at the bottom, we can see the output. So we've effectively got a table with one column that's got the name records. And then within there, we've got a list. And if we expand the list, we can see we've got a record ID, the fields, and we've got an object for each row in our base. Now, this is great because we know everything's working. However, it's not going to be easy for us to visualize the data, and we want to make it easier to work with. So before we start formatting the data, we want to ensure that the request was successful. Now, obviously, we know in this instance it was, but for example, say you're making a lot of requests and you don't have caching enabled, you could hit the Airtable API quota limit, and rather than just carrying on the workflow, it would be better to throw an error that you can then show to the user. Now, I'm not going to be covering how to display error messages on the front end. This is kind of a high level overview. However, if you want me to cover that, then I can create a video at a later date. That's not a problem. So to check whether a request was successful, we can add the logic node. And we can go to the options. And here we can set up conditions. So in this instance, we want to check whether the status code was 200. And that indicates whether the request was successful. If, for example, you got your API key wrong, then that would return a 401 error. But for now, let's just set the status code and check that it equals 200. So we'll save that. And again, we'll run the node. So if we take a look at the output, it's the exact same as it was before, but we now have two outputs. So the top one is if the request was successful, and the bottom one is if it failed. So if the request was successful, we effectively want to take the data returned in this cell, which is a list of records, and we want to turn that into its own table. So we can do that using the cell select node. So I'll drag that onto the canvas, go to the settings, going to select the column. In this instance, it's records, and we're going to leave the row index as 0 because we know it's going to be the first row, and there's always going to be 1 because we know the request was successful at this stage because we added the logic node before this step. So I'll click save, and then I'll run the request. If we select the node and take a look at the output, now it's looking more like a table. So we've got the ID, the created time, and then the fields. And the fields are effectively the columns. If we take a look at the Airtable documentation, we can see here we've got the fields, and then in there we've got the name, the image, the category, price, and description. And these correlate to the columns we've got in our base here. Now, the next thing we want to do is flatten out the data. But before we do that, I'm just going to add an error node in case the request failed. So I'll drag the throw error node, and I'll connect that to the bottom output on the logic node. I'm just going to type error for now, but you can make this more descriptive in your own workflows. And in this instance, we don't need to run the workflow again because we know it's going to evaluate to true, so there's really no need for this example. So next we're going to flatten the data. And this is effectively going to move the properties or columns within our fields object to the row level. And this will make more sense once I've flattened the data. So I'll drag the flatten node, go to the settings, and we're going to leave the options as the default. So we're only going to flatten to a depth of 1, and we're going to set the separator to be __. So we'll save that, and then we'll execute the workflow. And now you can see we've still got the ID and the created time. However, we've also got all of the columns and they're prefixed with fields. The reason they're prefixed with fields is because that was the column they were flattened from. So we can see we've got the title, the image, the category, the price, and the description. So we've got everything we need. Now, next, if there were columns that you may not want to return to the front end, you could use the column filter, and this lets you effectively select which columns you want to return. So just to show you that quickly, here you can select the columns. To be honest, we want all of the columns on the front end, but just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to exclude the created time. So I'll add the ID, title, image, category, price, and description. We'll save the node and then run it. Now we can see we've got all of the data we had before, we just don't have the created time. Now, having all of our columns prefixed with the word fields isn't ideal, and it's not going to help us at all on the front end. So next I'll rename those. And at the moment, this is a manual process. However, after more feedback from users since we launched last week, we are going to add a more automated process so you can do this. But for now, it is a manual one. So for each one, I'm just going to rename it. And I'm going to follow a camel case, which is all lowercase, separated by underscores rather than spaces. And this just makes it a lot easier to work with the data on the front end. So we've got title, then we've got the image, we've got the category, price, and description. And we'll execute the workflow. Now we've got our data, it's formatted correctly. Now you may be wondering, why are the headers in uppercase when we just set them to lowercase? This is purely visual. If you want to see the true representation, you can take a look at the JSON representation by clicking the plus icon, and here you'll see the data. So we've got the ID, we've got the image. Now the image is actually an array when you return the data from Airtable, an array of objects, and within those objects you've got the ID, the URL, the size, type, width, height, file name, and then thumbnails. Now thumbnails is another object. Within there you've got 3 objects. You've got full, large, and small, and each of those has a URL, width, and height property. Now the reason I'm mentioning this is because this is one of the changes following on from Alex's video previously. So in his videos, the image was a string, it was just a URL. Whereas now, this is obviously a lot more complicated, this instance when you're working with Airtable. So we will have a type definition for the thumbnails, and you'll see that when we jump into the code later. So we've created our workflow. It's all working. So next I'll publish the workflow, and I'll copy the API endpoint. I'm also just going to rename the name because I can see I got it. I had the tut all in lowercase. So in case you're wondering, you can go to the settings icon here, and here you can rename your workflow. You can also update the method if you decide that you should be making a post request, add authentication. You could, for example, add a captcha and do some other things, even generate schemas and all sorts. But for now, I'm just going to update the name. I'll save the changes, and then I'll just run the workflow again. We don't need to do this, but it's just so you can see how to run it manually. And now we've got all of the data. So the next step is to add the URL to the code. And this is really where we're following on from Alex's video. So I'm going to switch over to my code editor, and I'm using WebStorm. You can use whatever you prefer. I do recommend using one that has a server built in, or at least a plugin, a local server, because we will be hosting this file locally and then adding it to our Webflow project. It just makes development really easy. So here we've got the project, and before I jump in, actually, I just want to point you to where you can find this. So if you go to the Finsweet GitHub repository, you'll see here the attributes examples, and you can clone this, and then you'll have the code locally. You'll need to do npm install and then npm run dev, because we are effectively in development at the moment. I'm not going to run through how you can deploy this to production. This is something I believe that they're going to cover in the near future. So let's jump back into the code. And now I have already made the changes because my expertise are in back-end development. I'm not a TypeScript developer. So I have made the changes, and what I'll do is I'll publish those to GitHub, so then you can clone those. I probably won't get around to that today because I had a few things pop up, but I will show you the diffs now and just walk you through it. So we'll start with the types. So on the left here, we've got the types in the repository we cloned from Finsweet. We've got the ID, which was a number. And on the right-hand side, we've now got the changes that I've made, and just so you can see the two at the same time and kind of understand the changes. So in the fake product API that was used in their example, the ID was a number. Now, when you're working with Airtable, it will be a string, an alphanumeric value. So I've changed it to string. The title, price, description, and category have all stayed the same. However, it is worth mentioning that I have updated the category enum, as you can see here. But the real big change is with the image. So previously it was a string, whereas now it is an array of the type attachment. So if we take a look at the attachment here, we can see within there we've got the ID, width, height, URL, file name, size, type, and then thumbnails. So this kind of links into what I was showing you when we were in MiddleLink. Airtable has a specific structure for their attachments, and we're just setting up the type definition effectively so it matches that. And then if we take a look at the thumbnails type, here we've got small, large, and full, and each of these points a thumbnail, which has the URL, width, and height properties. So I just want to cover that so people know. And obviously, if you're using a different base from the one in this example, then you will need to add in the additional columns and their types. So yeah, just bear that in mind. This is a TypeScript tutorial. If you're not proficient in TypeScript, or it's not something you want to use, then you can use vanilla JavaScript. I just wanted to follow on from what they recommend at the moment, just to avoid any confusion. Next, we'll go to the index file. And again, on the left, we've got the original, and on the right, we've got the modified version. So there's only two changes in this file. So if you go to the fetch products function, you can see previously it called the fake store API, whereas now it's going to call the MiddleLink API endpoint we created. So I'm just going to paste the one we literally just created in there. And then if we go down to the create item, here you can see previously the image src was just set from the product.image, because effectively this was just an image URL. Whereas now we've got the array of attachments being returned, we need to tell it how to find the URL within that object or that array of objects. So to do that, we've got product.image. We're then getting the first item. And then within there, we've got the thumbnails. We're going to get the large one, and we're going to get the URL. Now, looking at this in hindsight, I probably should have renamed image to images. So I do apologize for that when I push this change so then you can clone it. I will update that. So I do apologize. But they're effectively the only changes that are made. So I'm going to save that. We'll now go back to our site. So I'll click refresh. And you can see the data is being loaded. Now, there is a significant delay there. So what we can do is enable caching to improve that. So if we go into MiddleLink, we'll go to the HTTP request node, and you can cache at the node level. Currently, we only support caching on the HTTP request nodes and the integration nodes, for example, the Webflow node. So we'll go to the HTTP request node. We'll go to caching, enable the cache. And for this instance, the menu is not going to update very frequently. So I'm just going to set the cache to 23 hours and then save the workflow. Now, if you ever want to clear the cache, you can either just make a change to the workflow and it'll automatically be cleared, or you can come into the settings and click the clear cache button here. So if we go back to the site in question and we click refresh, this request is going to make a request to MiddleLink, which is then going to call Airtable. It'll go back to MiddleLink where it will format the data and return it back to the browser. So this is one of the longer requests. Now, if we click refresh again, now what will happen is instead of that, it's going to call MiddleLink, see that the data has been cached, get the data, and then return it back to the browser. So we can see that there's a significant improvement there to the speed. And again, this video isn't going to cover UI, loading states or anything like that. If that is something you would like to see, then just let me know. We've got skeleton loaders for Webflow, like loader. We've got lots of things that improve the usability when you're working with external APIs. So if you'd like to see that, just let me know. And before I close off the video, let's just check all the filtering's working again. So we'll select drink. We can see we've got the drinks. We'll reset the filters. We'll sort by Z to A, and then we'll sort by A to Z. And then we'll click load more, and we can see everything's working. So if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out. If you're a MiddleLink user, the best way is via the live chat. If not, then just leave a comment in this video or contact me on Twitter. So I hope you all found this useful, and I'll see you in the next video.